Hello, everyone. This is JT Keating, Vice President of Product Strategy here at Zimperium, and we'd like to thank you for giving us a little bit of your time. We're going to have a discussion about what appears to be everybody's favorite topic, or at least a topic everybody talks a lot about, that being GDPR, with a particular emphasis on the side of the world that we play in, which is on the mobile side of things. As usual, we'll have a Q&A session at the end. Please do use the Q&A capability rather than the chat capability. The chat capability sometimes doesn't seem to come through the way that we would like, and then we will run through that and have any questions towards the end. So let's just start off by talking about our world. We like to start almost every one of our webinars with just a little reminder of the fact that mobile is the new PC, that mobile is in fact taking over from in many different metrics. Matter of fact, I saw one at the Gartner Security Summit just a couple of weeks ago. It was actually talking about the number of connected devices on the internet now surpasses the number of human beings on the planet, and will only just continue to distance itself as it's going forward. This particular one happens to be from a company called Zenith, and it's talking about the average number of minutes that people spend on mobile versus desktops. It doesn't matter whether it's this or whether it's a unit counts, whatever the case may be. Clearly, mobile is taking over. And since mobile is taking over and accessing a lot of things, mobile is the place that either we use to reach out to our consumers or we use to enable our employees. And therefore, anything from a privacy data standpoint, the GDPR standpoint, are directly relevant. And we're even going to be talking about some press coverage referring to mobile as kind of the forgotten endpoint of GDPR, and we'll have some conversations about that in a quick second. So first thing is a rhetorical question. Does your company allow customers or employees access from mobile devices? It is a rhetorical question because pretty much everybody does. It's only a matter of degree as to what you are doing. And the not so rhetorical question is, do you believe all those devices are completely safe? The simple fact is, everybody knows that the devices are not completely safe. Depending on whether or not you have instrumented any kind of monitoring or prevention standpoint, like a mobile threat solution like Zimperium, you just might not have the visibility to it. So which ones are we looking at? Bottom line is, mobile users improve the bottom line. Mobile employees, it's all about productivity, gaining access from from all over the place, BYOD, all sorts of things that are strictly around productivity enhancements. Mobile customers, of course, are much cheaper than people that come into a bank or come into interact directly, but they also increase risk because now the users are the admins of these devices, and they're quite often, almost always, outside of the protected corporate network that we spend billions of dollars protecting. So by definition, that also means that's where some of the data is going, and therefore we must pay attention to it from a GDPR standpoint. It's important to note that all mobile devices are vulnerable to attacks, and that the attacks are different and they vary. And depending on whether we're trying to protect employees, whether we're trying to protect consumers, they each come into play. So everyone always thinks about malicious apps because it's an easy thing to think of, and it's something we've been trained with coming all the way up. In mobile, because mobile, the apps on mobile devices cannot interact with other apps in the mobile devices, they're all in their own little containers. The majority of malicious apps that we see, and we produce a global threat report every single quarter, and you can download one of those from our site if you'd like. The majority of the malicious apps that we see are really untargeted, and they're all about fraud. That's because if somebody is actually, in fact, targeting an enterprise, so going after employees, the first logical step is not to drop an app in the App Store and hope somebody from XYZ Bank downloads it. Instead, sit in a coffee shop across from XYZ Bank, control the network, and when we control the network, deliver a device exploit. Because apps are containerized in mobile, the only way to remain persistent if you're a hacker, and let's assume that they're good at what they do, even if they're not good people, is they're going to be smart about, if I've taken the time and energy to take over a device, I want to remain persistent. The only way to do that is to, in fact, do some form of a device attack, either an elevation of privileges, gaining root access, et cetera, et cetera. And those things I'm talking about are not just on Android. They're on Android, iOS, even Windows 10 mobile, and they're consistent. It's consistent across those bears. So if you're protecting your employees, you're going to have to worry about device compromise, network attacks. If you're protecting your consumers, you have to worry more about apps, but then ultimately the other ones as well, because that's going to be what enables them to attack you. The threats are a clear and present danger. In 2017, Google and Apple released a record number of security patches. In the last couple months, or the last quarter of 2017 and the beginning part of 2018, Google had a monthly update, covered a record number of vulnerabilities, and Apple during that period of time had 5 security updates of their own. So obviously there's a need to update because there are known exploits that our team at Z Labs and some of the others constantly keep notifying. The problem is, even when those things are notified and put out, the patches, the user's the admin, and quite often the user doesn't take the time to update their software for various reasons, and or if you're on the Google side of things, it ends up running down through the course of how long did it take to go from Google to the handset manufacturer all the way out to the carriers. So 2/3 of the devices are out of date pretty historically. On average, 25 to 30% of iOS and close to 70% of Android is what we see when we do the work. 10% of the devices experience a man-in-the-middle attack. We've seen a 15% increase each quarter in that. This is when a bad guy controls the network, which, as I mentioned, is the primary attack vector under these devices. And even Gartner says that by the end of next year, 1/3 of all total malware in the world will be mobile. So the threats are very much real. We know this because 100% of our customers have detected threats. So if 100% of your customers detect threats and you haven't detected threats, that probably means you don't have instrumentation because the threats are out there and we've got tons and tons of data to back that up. Matter of fact, we'll be doing some webinars on one of our largest customers in a few weeks, and where we're millions of devices, and the stats are pretty staggering. So you can come back for that. But what about mobile compliance? And obviously, focal point for this webinar. One of the first things to note is an endpoint is an endpoint is an endpoint. If I have personal data, PII, sitting in my servers, if I have PII sitting on laptops and desktops, and if I have PII sitting on a smartphone or a tablet, from a compliance standpoint, there's no difference. I need to protect that data on those devices and in transit from those devices, regardless of what the endpoint is. So when we're talking about the GDPR side of things, it's critical to note wherever that data is, it has to live up to the laws of GDPR. So, talk about GDPR, and most folks on this call will probably be familiar with this, but in case you haven't come across it, it's all about protecting personal data and giving the owners of that data, ownership of that data really back to the person that it's about, as opposed to the company. So it gives a whole bunch of benefits to the end user, and the fines are pretty significant. The fines will be pretty significant in terms of what's going to happen for any kind of violation of the statutes. And basically, you need to use state-of-the-art, which is not my quotes, that's actually kind of quotes from the regulations itself, to safeguard that data through appropriate measures. Now that's pretty vague, right? Unlike a lot of the compliance mandates that have come before it, where, for instance, in HIPAA here in the United States, or PCI and payment card data worldwide, or NERC and the electric utilities, those are pretty prescriptive. They'll say, you must implement encryption, you must implement antivirus, you must patch on a regular basis, they're very prescriptive. GDPR is not that prescriptive, but what most of the experts believe is you need to look around at the other, what are the definitions of state of the art? And the reality is most of the mandates, again, whether it's PCI or HIPAA or NERC or any of the rest of them, if you ask security people, what they'll basically tell you is that's a minimum set of security requirements. Because everybody knows to truly be secure, you need to go beyond the letter of each one of those regulations. But if you use those as a proxy for GDPR's state of the art, then what you can do, and what a lot of our customers are doing, is looking sideways at those other regulations to say, okay, what is state of the art? And if you want, you can go to our website under our industry leadership tab. We've got a compliance section. And if you go down and look at the specific requirements, you'll never hear anybody from Zimperium, at least I hope you don't ever hear anybody from Zimperium, say, if you buy our stuff, you're magically HIPAA compliant. Nobody can say that, right? There's so many individual requirements, some of which are physical, some of which are cyber, and even within cyber, no one company solves everything, right? So we put the very specific requirements that have to do with mobile, have to do with endpoints for PCI, HIPAA, et cetera. I would recommend that you use that as the state-of-the-art definition to protect the integrity, confidentiality, and accountability of the process data. So as I was mentioning, if you go and look at those compliance mandates, what you'll see is a kind of common bucket of things, but on the GDPR part that are related to them, you need to do risk assessments. If you don't have any instrumentation, any visibility onto your mobile endpoints or any other endpoints, it's kind of hard to assess your risk. You don't know what your risk is, right? Updating your systems. This becomes particularly complicated in mobile, as we talked about, because the users are the admins. They're the ones who decide when they're going to patch. But using a solution like Zimperium and then a solution, let's say like EMM, you can actually kind of mandate for the employee side of the equation, what are we going to do to make sure those systems are on the latest update levels? So you have some control with that. On the consumer side, it's a little bit less clear because you don't really control their devices. In that case, what you really need to do is make sure that all your systems that are providing the mobile experience are the ones that are updated. If you don't have any kind of detection technology across any part of the ecosystem where the private data is, you can't really have proactive threat detection. You need to have that threat detection to be able to know what's going on and then have that in a timely enough fashion to rapidly be able to do your breach reporting with any kind of factual. So forensics, timing, all of that stuff matters. This is Gartner's data security governance framework, in case you're wondering what the DSG is. I put it in here because we actually believe in this. Even though we are a mobile security provider, we take a very consultative approach when we talk to our customers. We are, in fact, the enterprise leader in mobile threat defense pretty much always have been. Part of that is recognizing that you need to think about the overall framework and the overall business goals and strategies of the corporation first. Is it digital transformation? Is it GDPR? Is it whatever? Then you start stepping down to what is your security strategy? What are you trying to protect? What is your mobility strategy? What are you trying to enable? And then putting the two of those together. So we fundamentally agree with don't start at the bottom. Don't start because there's a bunch of people like us doing webinars, talking about, security for each one of the crypto or DLP or CASB or any of the rest of them, right? What you want to do is start at the top and say, what is our strategy? What is the nature of our governance? In this particular case, the compliance mandate is GDPR, but there could be some blend over into some of the other ones we've been talking about. And fundamentally, what is your IT strategy and what is your risk tolerance, right? How much risk are you willing to take in this overall play? Now, the fines are pretty significant, but at each individual decision, that's going to be up to the company. Then you start prioritizing the data sets and where they live. Where's my patient data? Clearly, if your patient data is sitting on servers, you need to prioritize that. And what a major part of that is going to be which servers and which regions are they in, and what kind of protection. Then you finally start rolling down into what are the various different things I need to deal with, including endpoints. So I recommend this. There's actually a great document from Gartner that we can provide the name. I don't have it right in front of me, but it's like a CISO's guide to GDPR governance. This is in there, but I just think it's a really nice framework for people to use. But specific to mobile, again, we have to protect employees that have any access to the data, and we need to protect the customers themselves in their environment whenever we are, in fact, doing this. And Computer World had this really interesting article last week where it basically is mobile the loophole to GDPR? And what they're talking about is with those kind of high-level descriptions of state-of-the-art, things on those lines, does mobile start to get lost in the equation? And their comment was, yes, in fact, it does. And it's a great article, again, Computer World, last week, you can go check it out. But here were some of the things that they said enterprises that are dealing with GDPR should do about mobile. First one is exactly what I said earlier. An endpoint is an endpoint is an endpoint. If any of those endpoints, including mobile devices, have access to the customer, to the end user data, or has that end user data on them, you have to pay attention to them. And our belief is that's both enterprise mobile devices as well as customer mobile devices. Second, you need to create your policy around that. And it needs to be as comprehensive and extensive as your overall GDPR. When we go back to the governance matrix just a minute ago, or the governance framework, what is our overall risk tolerance? What is our approach to this whole thing? And then once it's done, obviously it needs to be implemented, and then it needs to be monitored. Like I've said a couple times in this, one of the first things that we come across with new customers is they need to turn the lights on. They know that their mobile devices have been exposed to network attacks and device compromises and are risky from an OS level or have risky apps on them. They don't know how risky, and they don't know what the situation is. They don't know which ones are their problem children. So not only should this be implemented, but it needs to be monitored. And of course, it also needs to be monitored because you need to respond back in 72 hours if there's any kind of a breach. So I think it was interesting that, well, here's one of the major computer publications, not even a mobility publication, that thought this was a big enough issue to even bring it up. And of course, we have a tendency to agree. So briefly, this is not intended to be a product pitch, but it's intended to be a philosophical orientation for you. So here's Zimperium. And what we do is we're the enterprise leader in mobile threat defense. We have one engine that is a machine learning based engine that is unique from everybody else in the industry because it does 100% of the detection on device. So whereas a lot of the cloud-based solutions can be undercut by a man-in-the-middle attack, the primary attack vector we mentioned beforehand, we can detect even previously unknown threats across device, network, and app attacks on device. That one engine can be deployed out in one of two ways. It can be deployed out as a product called ZIPS, which stands for Z Intrusion Prevention System. It's basically next generation antivirus for mobile devices. And it runs 100% of the time on the device and protects that device that you own and the data that's on that device you own. So that's what the ZIPS product is. We can take the exact same Z9 engine and we can drop it into, we have an SDK, software development kit, where you can drop that exact same engine and detect those exact same threats, all of whom can get access to personal data, and we can put it directly into a mobile app. So coming back to who we need to protect, as a general rule, you would use ZIPS to protect your employees on their devices, whether it's BYOD or managed via EMM or any other solution, or Android for Work or any of those. And you would use ZApp predominantly to protect your customers, your end customers. So for instance, we have a financial services institution that is using ZIPS to protect hundreds of thousands of employees and using ZApp to protect millions of mobile banking customers. In that case, they're not responsible. In the second one, they're not responsible for protecting that device. That's a consumer's device. What they are responsible for is protecting that session, that transaction, and the customer data that's flowing back and forth from that under the guise and under the part of GDPR or any other. Both of those come into our console. It's called Z Console. It is a cloud-based console. Because of the fact we do all of our detection on device, we have many, many advantages, one of which is we're the only MTD player that is 100% cloud agnostic. So whereas the others that are doing cloud detection are locked into their one provider, which happens to be Amazon, we work on Amazon, we work on Azure, Oracle Cloud, Google, OpenStack, whatever the case may be. We can do on-prem versus SaaS, which for some GDPR companies are saying, you know what, we need to bring all this stuff. We need to have as much control on this as possible. We can do that, no problem. Behind our Z console is a technology we have called Z3A for advanced app analysis. This will actually go through all of the apps that are in your environment on, let's say your employee phones, and will tell you whether there's any additional security and privacy risks in those apps. Malicious apps would obviously be detected by Z9. Z3A can say, look, here's a legitimate app, but we don't know why a flashlight has access to your contacts or access to your camera. You might want to, tell your employees they can't have that app on there because it might be a conduit to something worse. Z Console interacts directly with, we've got the largest number of EMM players. We're also the only ones with multiple EMMs in a single console. And we're the only ones who's actually taken our agent and put it inside of one of the EMM players. And that's our partner, Mobile Iron, that has done that. And we can take all the data and forensics, everything you need for the reporting timeline of GDPR, and provide it directly into SIM to go to your SOC and to be able to be part of your incident response. So with that, I will stop and see if we have any questions from anybody, and then we can wrap things up. But we're hoping that your GDPR efforts are going quite well. So let's stop and see if we have any questions. So here's the first one, and that question is, given what we know, I think you're referring to Zimperium. Given what Zimperium knows, which would we protect first for GDPR, employees or end customers? To me, what I would do is I would go all the way back. Great question, by the way. And we get asked questions like that all the time. Matter of fact, we sometimes will even be more granular on the employee side and say, do you have a BYOD initiative? Do you have a corporate owned initiative? And then, oh, by the way, you've got your end customers. To me, the answer isn't straightforward, because what I would do is I would go back to the Gartner governance framework and say, okay, which of those initiatives means the most to us? For me personally, so in other words, like, it depends on what you guys have as a business strategy and what you guys have from a risk profile. We'd be happy to sit down with you and run through this. For me personally, I have a tendency to believe that protecting the customer straight up would be the first step, because I think the auditors and everybody are going to, they're going to be kind of coming along that continuum and figuring out what things are they going to enforce and what is state-of-the-art security and things on those lines. In the meantime, getting closest to what does it take to protect that customer, that end user's data, would be where I would, as a default, as a hypothesis coming in, I would start with those. Because you're already going to be securing your servers, you're already going to be figuring out, where do we have the regions of in each cloud of where the data is. The employees may or may not be having access to it, so that would be part of the equation. But for a fact that the end users have access to it because it's their data and they're the ones interacting with your systems. So I would probably start with the mobile apps myself for the end customers. Let's see if we have any other questions. It appears we do not. So thank you all very much for your time. As usual, this will be archived and we can provide slides to folks. Again, I strongly suggest grabbing that CISO for GDPR primer from Gartner and taking a look at that, because it does an excellent job of kind of breaking all this stuff out. And I'm sure we'll be talking about this topic again going forward. So thank you very much for your time. Have a great day.